Oh, g'day, welcome back. So in today's lesson, we're gonna go over bishops versus knights. So I've got a cracker lesson in store for you. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. We're gonna cover which ones are better, bishops or knights, um, when they are better, each of them. We're gonna look at it from an endgame perspective, middle game perspective, open, closed positions, the whole shebang. And hopefully you'll walk out feeling a little bit more confident that you know how to play chess, especially with the likes of bishops and knights. So yeah, let's crack into it. As you can see by the screenshot there, some drunk bloke actually asked Kasparov bishop or knight, and his response was quite interesting actually. So traditionally, bishops and knights are, when you're taught to play chess, you're told bishops and knights are worth 3 points each. Pawns are worth 1 point, rooks 5 points, and the queen 9 points. And the king's obviously worth the game. But as you start playing your games and you start progressing in your chess career, essentially, you start noticing that okay, it's actually really difficult to just say 3 points each of material for each of a knight and a bishop because there's so many nuances. And Kasparov said he actually agreed with Fischer's assessment that bishops are worth slightly more than knights at 3.25 points, and knights being 3 points. And that's pretty much because bishops are usually more useful than knights in more positions. So I've got some notes there on the right hand side. Take a look through them, but we'll cover them in the examples. So we're going to start with an endgame example. So when it comes to endgames, what you want to look at is the pawn structure. If the play or if the pawns, if there's pawns on both sides of the board, so in this case we're playing on both sides of the board, bishops are actually better because they can control both sides of the board from anywhere. They're long range pieces, whereas the knight actually has to jump into the action. It takes time, and then when it's, let's say the knight gets to c6, it then takes time to get back onto the king side. It's just a slower piece to maneuver. In this position, white's up a pawn, but white's going to have a tricky time converting that advantage into a win. White is obviously going to try get a passed pawn, but black's bishop is going to be able to control that b7 square and control the king side. So black will have a lot of counterplay and maybe even walk away with the draw. In this position, on the other hand, if black has the extra pawn and has the bishop, well, that bishop's going to absolutely be a monster and dominate. It's going to be able to protect the pawns as they scroll, as they stream down the board, and it's going to have an eye on the king side. So essentially, in endgames where there's play on both sides, bishops are superior to knights. Even if we took that pawn off the board, even if it's equal material, that bishop is going to be better for black. It's a drawn position, but black's the one who's going to try get his king up to here, put pressure on that pawn, and then advance the kingside pawns with the bishop being able to play on both sides of the board, whereas that knight's going to be stuck on one side of the board. On the other hand, if the pawns are on one side of the board, so in this case, white is a pawn up, and the pawns are on one side of the board, the bishop's strength of being a long-range piece is limited. It no longer needs to be a long-range piece. And now the knight being able to get to both colors of the board, so white and black squares, is going to have the advantage over the bishop. Now, again, this position is too simple, too simplified. It's probably going to fizzle out into a draw, even though white's a pawn up. But white is the only one who has winning chances in this position because white's going to try exploit the dark squares, so maybe wait for black to play something like pawn to g6, and maybe white might start getting his pawns on dark squares so that the bishop can't attack them. Now the bishop's also limited in its scope because the pawns are on white squares, and white will have control of the dark squares much more easily and probably be able to exploit that. Now it's going to be a long drawn out process from here, but that's essentially where the advantage of the knight comes in. Even if you take away that e3 pawn, this is a more solid position for white to play. It's a draw, but picture it with a few more pieces in the position, maybe with queens or a couple more pawns, or maybe some pawns on the queen side. White's ability to use that knight on any square of the board is going to be advantageous for white. Now let's go back to a middle game. In closed positions, knights are kings, and in closed positions, bishops have their long-rangedness limited because the position's closed, they're blocked behind pawns. See, this light squared bishop is not going to feature in this game for a long time. This dark squared bishop is not attacking anything. Even white's dark squared bishop, which would have come from c1 to e3, was blocked by its pawns. If it was white to move here, a move like bishop to h4, just getting rid of that dark squared bishop, so that white now has a light squared bishop, a good light squared bishop, versus black's bad light squared bishop. The knights are still going to be the dominating pieces in this game, because once, let's just say, what is it, white to move, so let's just say g4, g6. White's got control of all these dark squares, and only the knights can access those squares. Even if black doesn't play g6, it's really a knight-centric game. Black's going to try to play b5, knight c6, a5, b4, with that knight trying to support on the queen side. And this knight's probably going to drop back to f8 and defend the king side and that h7 square. But in closed positions, knights, because they can maneuver slowly, they have the advantage over bishops. Now let's go into not open positions, so we'll come to an open position in a second, but let's go into a semi-open position. So that's when the position is not quite closed, but it's not quite open either. The pawns are in a pretty fixed structure, so this is like a classic London style queen pawn structure. The bishops are usually better still if it's the right bishop. So in this case, white has a light squared bishop and can put pressure on that on that king side, or prevent black from playing a move like b5 to play b4 and a pawn break. But if white had a pawn on a bishop on e3 instead, white would have a bad bishop, and then it would probably be slightly more equal of a position. But in this case, because white's bishop is pretty active and it controls both sides of the board, it's going to take a bit of time for black to get his knight into any sort of a strong position where it exerts any sort of dominance over that bishop or white's position in fact. So in semi-closed positions, bishops are still relatively better than knights. You can kind of see we're going backwards, right? The less pawns, the more open the position is, the better the bishops are. Now, if we get to a very, so we've removed those d pawns, the position's a little bit more open. Here again, it's a pretty equal position, but again, we're discussing the nuances between bishops and knights. If you think about the prospects for this knight, it really doesn't have many prospects. It can, maybe swing around to d5 or f5. Swinging around to e5 probably doesn't do much. It's going to get chased away pretty quickly. So it's hard for black to exert any sort of pressure on white's position with a knight in this position or in similar open positions, whereas white has a pretty clear plan of directing his bishop onto that b1 h7 diagonal, possibly even getting the bishop to e4 to apply pressure on the queen side and the king side at the same time, or likewise similar to how the bishop on d3 controls both sides of the board here. You got a similar plan with the bishop on d3 here. And furthermore, if pieces start getting traded, so let's just play a few moves just for the sake of it, and let's trade off all the major pieces. If we get into a position like this, does that not start to look quite familiar to these types of positions, right? Where the bishop and the knight, the endgame is a bishop versus knight, and you've got a queenside majority here as white. So white's plan is probably going to be to play something like getting the bishop onto that f3 square or e4 square, exerting pressure on that queen side, rushing the pawns up the board, obviously getting the king up the board as quickly as possible, and then just marching the pawns forward. And that bishop's going to support the queen side pushes, whereas that knight, really it's just black's going to struggle and just hope for a draw in this position. It is a drawn position, but it is in favor of white in this position because white's got the bishop. Last but not least, I'm probably painting a very grim situation, right? How can the bishop be that dominant? Well, there's a lot of positions where the knight is going to dominate the bishop. This is one of them. So black's got a bad bishop. That bishop's blocked in by its own pawns in the same colors. Whereas white has the knight, and it's on an outpost where it cannot be chased away by a pawn on c6 or e6. And white, again, it's a relatively equal position. There's still heaps to play in here, but white does have the advantage because white is the one who can exert the pressure. Black's got a backwards d6 pawn. White is always threatening to take that bishop, and once the queen takes, maybe if the white queen was on b4, you'd have pressure on with the queen, and then maybe if the rooks were doubled up here, you would have two rooks and a queen attacking that pawn on d6. Black could lose that d6 pawn pretty quickly, and that bishop is really just a spectator in this game. It's not doing anything except defending its own position. Black will never be able to get an advantage with a bishop this bad, and white's always going to be able to exert pressure with that knight. And even in some cases, the white might even swing onto the f5 square and apply pressure on that g7 square with a kingside attack and pressure on d6, and even, in fact, for that matter, just dropping back to c3 and b5, putting pressure on a7 and d6 this way. So that knight dominates that bishop in this case. So when you're trading pieces, just be mindful when you're trading down. Are you going to end up in an endgame where you're unfavorable, or you're going to enter a middle game where you're unfavorable or favorable? So make sure that you take these principles to heart, apply them in your chess games. And finally, needless to say, I think it clearly shows that bishops are better in most positions, or in general, just slightly over knights. And the final point I'll touch on is having two bishops, i.e. the bishop pair, is usually considered an advantage. And sometimes in the opening or middle game, you'd actually sacrifice a pawn in order to take one of your opponent's bishops with your knight. So then they have one bishop, whereas you have two bishops, and you then have the bishop pair, which means your bishops can influence all the squares on the chessboard because they cover both colors, whereas your opponent can only control one set of squares. And then your whole game becomes trying to take advantage of your opponent's square color complex where they don't have that bishop. So for instance, if you had both bishops and your opponent had a dark squared bishop, you would be trying to play on the light squares because your opponent's bishop cannot defend the light squares because it's a dark squared bishop. So there you have it, bit of a rundown. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Peace out, like and comment if you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think, and catch you on the next one. See you later. Bye.